Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be welcoming you all to BSI's annual Net Zero Week and to kick off this exciting programme of events. As the national standards body representing the interests of UK industry on the global stage, BSI is at the forefront of helping accelerate change in the way we tackle our economic, social, and environmental challenges. Preventing the devastating impacts of climate change and achieving the target of reaching net zero by 2050 is the greatest challenge of our time. Our international team of experts work in every sector, sharing best practice, shaping standards, finding new ways to measure organisational progress towards net zero to ultimately help us all get to the heart of the issues surrounding our sustainability challenges. It is our mission to actively support you to achieve your sustainability goals, whether you're at the beginning of your sustainability journey or at a point where our support can help you progress to the next steps. Net Zero Week provides a unique platform to showcase the scope of the work being done across key sectors to meet global carbon emission targets. The series of engaging webinars taking place throughout the week will cover a range of key topics from sustainable finance to net zero in the food supply chain. And through these interactive sessions, we really aim to provide you with the expert knowledge and the latest industry updates to help you reduce carbon emissions and to help encourage you to join us in working towards the UK's ambitious net zero targets. To mark the start of this week, we're also very proud to share our Net Zero Barometer report for 2022. And it provides critical insights into how UK businesses are managing their transition to net zero. Now, based on the results from the survey of 1,000 UK senior decision makers and sustainability professionals, the report highlights that whilst almost half of the respondents are focused on business growth, only 20% are prioritising reducing carbon emissions. Given that time is of the essence, this highlights the extent of the challenge that we're facing. Now, that said, it's not all doom and gloom, and our annual survey also revealed a desire and an optimism actually from participants that the UK would achieve its net zero goal. And nearly 3/4 of those surveyed had already set targets to meet net zero. Post COP26, 78% of respondents were more convinced that reaching net zero targets is possible. For further insights into how industry leaders are paving the way for a sustainable future, the BSI Net Zero Barometer Report 2022 is available to access from the link in the Teams chat. Finally, I want to express my thanks to the organisers who've been working tirelessly to ensure the success of this year's Net Zero Week. Thank you to our inspiring speakers for giving up their time to share their insights with us. And thank you to all of you who have registered to participate in these sessions. It really is only through collaborative action that we can pave the way to a sustainable future. Thank you.
I'd like to tell you about a partnership we agreed last year with BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It came about because we had a new energy management standard due to launch, aimed at small and medium-sized organisations to help them reduce energy consumption and therefore reduce carbon emissions. Now, there's a lot that any organisation can do to support their journey to net zero, but reducing energy usage is a key part of it. I asked BEIS if they'd like to partner with us on the launch of this new standard, knowing the standard would match their aims to support SMEs on their journey to reaching net zero. They were really enthusiastic, so I asked them if they'd like to sponsor some copies so that they could be offered for free download. They agreed they'd sponsor 100,000 copies of the standard. We created a special version of the standard and a guide to using it, and both are available for free download from our website. So if you'd like a copy of our phased approach to energy management standard and a free guide, please visit the website. The link is in the chat, but you can just Google BSI 50005 Energy Management. We have a webinar coming soon, so keep an eye out for that and come along and ask our experts any questions you'd like an answer to. Please do share the link with your members, colleagues and friends so they can see how their organisations can benefit from the standard.
Okay, thank you everyone. Let's get started then. Hello and welcome to today's Built Environment session in BSI's week of events on net zero. We're going to be talking about the role of innovation in helping the built environment achieve net zero. I'm Claire Price. I'm the sector lead in the built environment team here at BSI, and I'm going to be chairing the event today. So we've got a packed day for you, but first some housekeeping. It's a listen-only webinar that's being recorded. We welcome your questions via the Q&A function. All the questions will be taken at the end when I'll be joined by the panel on the screen to run through some questions. So please do submit them as we go along, and I'll be picking those up at the end. And covering those off. If you do experience any technical difficulties, please submit your issue via the Q&A function. There will be a feedback survey at the end, and we'll be forwarding the presentations and the recording of the webinar to you all in due course as well. It is a CPD recognised webinar. So please request your certificate if you want that via the feedback survey following the webinar. So we're running to about between 12 and 12:30 today. We'll be finished by 12:30. All right. So the target of net zero for countries and for industry, and the importance of working to control global temperature increases is, as Susan said, the key challenge of our age. There really is a growing and indeed palpable sense of urgency on this, and the need for actions to match targets and pledges and all the talk around this subject. Everything we do and how we do it is being interrogated, and the impacts being measured so that changes, those much needed changes, can be made. And the built environment industry has been no exception. And of course, that's essential, given that our industry is responsible for around 40% of the UK's carbon footprint. There are a lot of initiatives underway, of course, all the work being driven by the Green Construction Board, the Construction Leadership Council, the ICE and the other institutions, among many others. And I'm thinking of the Construct to Zero initiative and the Zero Construct initiatives in particular. There is, of course, more established and long-standing work addressing operational carbon management and reduction in buildings that's been going on for many years now. There's also the acknowledged importance of retrofit, energy retrofit for buildings and for extended life in infrastructure. And lately, the growing interest in the measurement and reduction of embodied and whole life carbon in buildings and infrastructure. You know, we've had the standards in place for quite some time, and that is a growing portfolio of standards around embodied whole life carbon, but not really the policy in place to drive more take up of those standards and use of those standards. But hopefully that is now coming soon. And then, of course, there is innovation and the subject of this webinar today. So in addition to what can be done right now by the industry, acting upon the structures we have and using the knowledge and standards that already exist, the built environment is innovating in order to go further. Innovating in terms of developing new materials and products, and also innovative thinking, modifying processes such as design for material efficiency, improving delivery of design performance, addressing impacts from manufacturing. But where there is innovation, there is a real need for dissemination. People need to know about new solutions and how they work. More importantly, that these solutions do work. There needs to be verification, assurance, education, so that new solutions are adopted and can be relied upon. And there needs to be standards. Clients, specifiers, planning officials all need to be confident that what is being delivered works, i.e. that it does what it says on the tin. Standards help to speed up rollout and take up because they give confidence, because they've been developed with all stakeholders and painstakingly, sometimes, agreed by consensus. But there also needs to be those other drivers. It's not just about standards. Drivers from government, policy drivers, and from clients, the demand for new ways of doing things. And on the delivery side, funding for the essential R&D to develop better solutions. All of that is needed for innovation to become mainstream, to become the normal way of doing things, the standard way of doing something. So we're looking at the role of innovation in helping us achieve net zero, but also how can we ensure innovation can fulfill its potential and actually be taken up and disseminated. All right, so let's look at the agenda for today's session. So with all that in mind, today we're going to be hearing about three key initiatives. The low carbon concrete route map, which is published today, and we're really privileged to be having a preview of it before the proper launch at the ICE this afternoon. I think it's at the ICE, both online and in-person event this afternoon. So this is a really important piece of work. British and European standards for concrete number in the many hundreds. It's hugely important material, widely used, and the number of standards reflect that. But it is very costly in emissions. BSI has been involved in the development of the route map and expect to be working with industry and our committees to respond to the recommendations in it. There'll be a lot more to say about that in the coming months. We'll then be hearing about PAS 2080, the first carbon management standard, originally published in 2016, that is now being revised. It's been very successful, widely used by the infrastructure industry, and the revision is expected to incorporate learnings from use and some of the new thinking in this field. And we are also looking to elevate the PAS to an international standard following this revision to increase take-up even more widely. And finally, we'll be hearing about the difficulties presented by the need to allow reference to new and innovative products in existing standards and behaviours, and what needs to be done to speed up that process so that benefits can be realised quickly. As I've said already, we'll have questions at the end, so please do submit them as we go, and I'll pick them up then. All right, I think that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Andy to talk about the low carbon concrete route map. Andy's the Managing Director of Amcrete UK, which provides concrete technology support and advice to the construction industry. And he's the chair of the low carbon concrete group that has been working so hard to develop and agree the route map. Thanks. I'll hand over to Andy now.
Thank you very much, Claire. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can see me and hear me. I'm sure somebody will give me a shout if I can't be seen or heard. Well, thanks very much for inviting me along this morning. As Claire said, later on this afternoon, we've got the formal launch of the low carbon concrete group route map, which is being hosted by the ICE. So maybe some of you will be able to attend that later on this afternoon. So I'm chair of the low carbon concrete group and have been for the last 2 years since its inception, which was brought together by Claire, herself, and Chris Newsom. So we came together 2 years ago with a view of developing a route map which will help the industry achieve the net zero targets which is now set by the government. So next slide, please. So the low carbon concrete group, the route map itself is published today. It's a comprehensive document. It's probably about 80, 85 pages in total. Next slide, please. So So what we're going to talk about today, where we started, who was involved, the strands of the route map. So we'll dive into that in a little bit more detail so you get a better understanding of the contents of the route map. Brief bit on the launch, and then a little bit of detail on the next steps, which is the final chapter of the route map itself. So next slide, please. So 8th of January 2020 at the Bays Conference Centre, Chris Newsom and Claire Price brought a few people together, a small number as it was at the time, with a view, an open discussion, roundtable discussion, to see what the industry needs to do and could do. So the aim of the initiative was defined by Claire and Chris to develop a route map for reducing the carbon in existing cementitious materials and increasing the take-up of low carbon cementitious materials. So it's long been the case that we have established standards for cementitious materials, as Claire was alluding to just before. There were people within the industry who were looking more towards non-Portland cement based materials as being the silver bullet that would drastically reduce our embodied carbon in our concrete related works. However, what we have written within our route map is the fact that the strategies that the industry needs to employ is a combination of existing technologies as well as providing opportunities for new technologies. There is no one silver bullet. We can't do away with Portland cement, the traditional technology for concrete. We have to rely on the existing technology, but we can be a lot more clever, i.e. we can optimize those existing materials as well as develop new technologies as they come online. Next slide, please. So the route map itself, people came together. So we had industry consultants, clients, quite a few universities, structural engineers, architects, research organisations, concrete producers, members of the MPA and the Concrete Centre, cement manufacturers, main contractors. So you can see that the group itself was formed of a multidisciplined set of people, so that the outcome of the route map wasn't biased in one area, wasn't biased towards Portland cement, wasn't biased towards AACM, wasn't biased towards how we design. It encompassed the skills and the knowledge and the views of the whole industry, including clients. Clients had a significant role to play in the last 2 years in developing this route map. So we can say that this is probably an industry first, is that this route map, which sets it apart from most others that have gone before, is a multidiscipline piece of work over 2 years, comprehensive piece of work for 2 years that everybody has contributed to. Next slide, please. The route map is split down into 7 strands, where there's actually 8 chapters, 7 strands, and then the 8th chapter is the next steps. So the strands talk about continuous benchmarking. We need to establish where we are today in our embodied carbon, what levels we're actually emitting, and then how we can measure going forward where we are today, so we can demonstrate any improvements that we are making. Knowledge transfer, as Claire said, dissemination of new technologies, dissemination of better ways of doing things, better ways of designing, ideas and opportunities. That is absolutely key across the industry in allowing the whole industry to drive the embodied carbon down when using cement and concrete. So knowledge transfer starts at universities, it starts in ongoing training, it starts with asking questions, difficult questions, which should be responded to with hard decisions and firm information and knowledge about what can be done. Strand 3 details design and specification, how structural engineers can influence negatively as well as positively the embodied carbon of a concrete element and structure. How we can reuse existing structures, but if we can't do that and we have to go through to new build, the role and responsibility of the structural engineer to begin that collaboration between the contractor and the concrete producer to meet the performance requirements of the structure, as well as the other standards which need to come into play. The strand 4, the construction and operation. So it's not always easy for contractors to change their method of construction. So again, collaboration at an early stage should be able to demonstrate to the contractor that there's other ways that we can do things. We can build the same structure but in a different method and reduce the carbon. And it's the same thing for the concrete producers. Not every concrete producer can provide a wide array of different concrete mix designs. So careful thought needs to go into that when we're planning a job, when we're designing it, what materials we're going to use. Are those materials available? Can a concrete producer provide them to a particular job? Strand number 5 is optimizing existing technologies. So that's where we go back to our tried and tested Portland cement concretes. Within this strand, we look to challenge the existing standards. Are they relevant today? Can we improve upon them? And a prime example would be something such as the minimum cement contents. When the standards were originally drafted, the cements that we were using in those days probably are not as good as they are today. So the modern cements today probably don't need the same amount of cement content that are in the standards. So that's one area that we've called for some research and development into to reduce that. In actual fact, if we only manage to reduce our cement contents by 10%, that's going to have a significant impact on our carbon intensity. So we're looking to optimize our existing technology, and that includes looking at the availability of GGBS. If we use GGBS here in this country, are we denying the use of that GGBS elsewhere? If that is the case, then we may not actually be contributing to reducing the carbon intensity of concrete works globally. So these are major difficult questions and points that we have discussed in the route map. And hopefully, when you read through it, you'll be able to see that we have kind of identified a route to using GGBS in lower volumes in order to extend the available materials. Strand number 6, adopting new technology. Again, a very popular strand. Everybody wanted to get involved in this because it's exciting, new technology coming on board. The thing about adopting new technology is it has to be fit for purpose. So if you develop a new cement material, it has to go through a rigorous regime of testing to demonstrate that it is suitable and fit for purpose. That point can be forgotten about by the technology owners themselves. Sometimes there might be a rush to market, but unfortunately, concrete is a very patient technology, and it takes time to develop any new technology, to test it in the lab, to test it in the field, to review it, and provide assurance that it is equal to or better than what we already use. And it can be a long, expensive road. In the route map, we set out how a new technology can be brought to market. And we discussed technology readiness levels as well as commercial readiness levels. It's an exciting area, but at the same time, it can be quite a long period from inception through to bringing it to market. But we do go into it in quite a significant amount of detail. Strand 7 deals with carbon sequestration. So we're talking about CCUS. It's not a very big strand. There's not a great deal of information that was made available to us. But we do see CCUS as end of pipe solution. There are many things that the industry can do today and in the near future, but CCUS is not the golden bullet or the final solution. It can only be part of the solution, and it probably won't be ready for the industry till beyond 2030, 2035, by which time, if we adopt the recommendations within the route map today and we carry them forward, we will be in a much better place by 2035 to adopt CCUS. And in fact, at that point, if CCUS is demonstrated to be a good solution, we may well actually start moving into negative carbon emissions. Next slide, please. So here we've got three images. What's in the route map? The image on the left-hand side, that's the route to market for a new technology. From inception, for somebody having a really good idea, discovering a new technology, and it goes through the stages, and those are involved through from TRL, technology readiness levels 1 through to 9. That includes the steps of demonstrating applications for European technical assessments, the compilation of technical dossiers. So the steps there clearly defines the amount of work that is required for any new technology. The image on the right at the top there, that's our proposal for an embodied carbon rating certificate for concrete being delivered to a project. With the technology available to us today and the modern systems that concrete batches are using, we don't feel that it's too much of a hardship to have a delivery ticket, to have a carbon rating certificate embedded into it based on the cement content of that particular mix design. But if that is proven to be too difficult at the beginning, it's certainly something that the contractor can provide the client at the end of a project for the concrete that's been consumed throughout the entire project. Each mix design or each reference can have an embodied carbon rating certificate, which then goes into the O&M file. The bottom image there, that's our rating for strength classes and embodied carbon. That's what sets the benchmark. So within the document, there's more graphs similar to this with more detail. But the structural engineer and the client can set a benchmark for a project, and then it's then incumbent upon the concrete producer and the contractor working in tandem to meet that benchmark or better it. However, we do know there are occasions when what the structural engineer and the client want can't be achieved for whatever reason. But then that would just require justification from the contractor and concrete producer why a certain benchmark or a certain cement type or a certain minimum or maximum embodied carbon for mixed design can't be achieved. Next slide, please. Towards the back of the route map, we demonstrate in graph form the possible routes to reducing our carbon, even getting to negative carbon emissions. So we have 3 routes that the LCCG has been able to plot: route 1, route 2, route 3, and they're all dependent upon when various strategies are employed and to what degree. Neither route is the right one and neither route is the wrong one, and there may be strategies from route 1 that go into route 2, and so it's moving all the time. But if we introduce a decisive and robust measuring and reporting tool, which we're already working on, we will be able to track how the progress that we're making and how well we are doing or not. Now, bearing in mind that the predictions are that concrete consumption is due to increase over the next 5 or 6 years. GGBS as an addition is likely to decrease in availability. On paper, that may lead us to think that all we're going to end up doing is increasing our production of and consumption of Portland cement. So we need to be able to have a good starting point for our benchmark and being able to report against that. And if we plot our routes, we can measure against that from our benchmark. The route map then discusses replacements for our current suite of replacement materials such as fly ash and GGBS. So a tremendous amount of work is required to bring calcined clays and greater proportions of limestone within our cementitious materials, and that's something actually that the Concrete Centre and the MPA have already embarked upon. So the increase of those materials may well lead to a positive result in relation to routes 1, 2 and 3, combined with effective good strategies from structural engineers, reusing structures and so forth. Next slide, please. So today, later on this afternoon, we have the launch at the ICE at 1 Great George Street. There'll be speakers and a panel discussion, and I'll be in there for 10 minutes repeating more or less what I've said to you this morning. But one of the key things I'd like to bring out now is that the route map isn't just a compilation of good ideas by people who are concerned about climate change and reducing the embodied carbon. The route map is endorsed by ICE, Institute of Structural Engineers, and just as importantly, it's endorsed by the Concrete Centre and the MPA. Okay, so we're brought together by CLC, the Green Construction Board, but there are some major endorsements from ICE, Institute of Structural Engineers, and the MPA, and so much so that quite a bit of what we've written and enshrined within the route map has already been lifted off the pages by other groups, and they are starting to use it, such as developing the carbon measuring and reporting tool and the benchmark, 2 critical things. So although the launch is this afternoon, work has already started on some of the contents of the route map. And as of today, there will be the formation of the Concrete Decarbonisation Task Force, which will be headed up by the ICE. Next slide, please. So typical questions that we've discussed or been asked in various presentations over the last 2 years is, why do we have three routes to 2050 in the next step sections? Does the government have a role to play? If so, what does BEIS need to do? How can people support the work of the GCB? And why didn't the LCCG just adopt the MPA roadmap? Well, look, the answers to all those questions are actually within the document. But essentially, the LCCG route map is different from other roadmaps because we don't just identify what the problem is, we actually dive down into a granular level of how everybody collaboratively can reduce the carbon intensity of the work that we do at a granular level. Okay. Does the government have a role to play? Yes, of course it does. Legislation, okay, that's what's needed. We as an industry have a moral obligation not to wait for legislation, not to wait for policies, but to actually get on with it and do it. We know what we need to do. We do know how we could do it. It's up to us not to wait for someone to tell us to do it. It's actually up to us to say, right, here we go, let's get on with it. But we can only do that if we collaborate. We do need guidance, but guidance typically lags technology. As I said, concrete is a very patient technology. So the route map describes how we can manage that. So it's now the case that we have received communication from Syria, BEIS themselves, and BSI, contractors, and a few other organisations. So in the next 4 weeks, we're going to open up with a roundtable discussion whereby all these groups of representatives are going to come together and we're going to put some ideas down on the table and see, first and foremost, how we can tackle the perception of standards. Do they support the reduction in carbon, embodied carbon, or not? Do standards support the use of new technologies or not? So maybe we need to lift some parts of the route map and put them into their own PAS, or even start to develop them as a standard. So in the next 4 to 5 weeks, that roundtable discussion will start that process. So that's very exciting, and that's one thing that I really am looking forward to beginning that. Next slide, please. So that's my presentation and my comments. So thank you. And do you have any questions?
Thanks very much, Andy. I think we'll hold off on questions until the end, and we'll have it on the panel session. But one thing that did come up, which perhaps we can answer now, is when is the route map going to be available, and where can people get it from?
The route map is available now. Certainly, it'll be available after 2:30 this afternoon, and there is a link on the ICE webpage for that, available free download.
Great. All right. Thanks very much then.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to move on now to Maria and Helene, who are going to talk about PAS 2080. Maria is Mcdonald's global technical lead for net zero. She's been a chartered engineer with over 18 years of experience in investment planning, carbon and asset management. She's led a number of strategic decarbonisation projects in infrastructure, including the Water UK Net Zero Carbon Roadmap. Maria's been supporting water utilities and other infrastructure owners in the UK, Australasia, North America and the Middle East to plan and implement decarbonisation solutions. Helene is an Associate Director at Arup, driving climate action and sustainable development in the Infrastructure Group in London. She's an enthusiastic promoter of whole life decarbonisation of infrastructure. And Helene advances and coordinates sustainable development and whole life carbon strategies for the built environment. She combines her deep engineering knowledge with the belief that the construction industry is key for the net zero carbon transition and contributing towards environmental regeneration, responding to the climate and biodiversity crises. They're joint technical authors for the PAS 2080 revision. So I'll hand over to you both now. Thanks so much. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Claire, and hello everybody. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to update you on where we are with the PAS 2080 revision. I'll start and then hand over to Maria in a second. So hopefully we won't spend too much time on the detail and have enough to get some good questions from you, please. So can I have the next slide, please? So as a starting point and for giving the context, I would like to step back a bit and look at the development of carbon management thinking. So the original PAS 2080 was conceived in response to the infrastructure carbon review that was published by the Treasury in 2013. And the BSI published the first PAS in 2016, after the COP21 Paris Agreement to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels. Since then, you will all agree, I think, that the political and legal landscape have changed significantly, with the UK in 2019 declaring a legal obligation for net zero carbon transition by 2050 and setting an ambitious 6th carbon budget last year. And the unprecedented mobilization of decarbonisation pledges and initiatives around the COP26 in Glasgow in November 2021 indicates the rapid shift in priorities of business and government. Yet the infrastructure industry are making slow progress. Early last year, the Green Construction Board published our review of carbon case studies since the Infrastructure Carbon Review. The paper concluded that although there are several good examples of decarbonisation, we need to accelerate our efforts if we are to realize the net zero carbon ambition. And this has highlighted the need for a revision of the 2016 PAS 2080. Can I have the next slide, please? So where is the carbon? Just a reminder, the effort required for decarbonisation across all sectors of the economy cannot be underestimated. Some sectors are progressing better than others. There has been some great progress since 1990 in the energy generation and industry, but sectors like transport and buildings are slow to change. And surface transport is now the single biggest carbon emitter, and the lion's share of its emissions is from the use of the road network. And the amount of persistent annual carbon reduction required between now and 2035 is much bigger than anything experienced in the past in these sectors. Next slide, please. So just also a note to self, there is a tendency to consider the bits of carbon that we are most familiar with, capital and operational mostly. However, cumulative whole life carbon is what we're trying to reduce, and the majority by far of the carbon emissions is locked in the existing buildings and infrastructure stock and their networks. And how their used and sustained user behaviors is fundamental for tackling decarbonization. So we should be contemplating the whole system. The way we built, what we built, where and how we built it has to drastically change, together with the way it locks in behavioral patterns. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the 7 years on report, and the lessons learned from that review were very clear. There are no procurement incentives for decarbonization. Our efforts are limited because our industry very much operates in silos. Most of the carbon reduction is focused on the low-hanging fruit and capital carbon without proper consideration of the whole life implications of it. There is no consideration of the majority of carbon already locked in the highly inefficient existing infrastructure and building systems, and the urgent need for retrofit. And carbon leadership is still very cautious. Next slide, please. So it was time for a revision of the PAS 2080. The revised scope is now widening the audience to include the whole building environment, both buildings and not just infrastructure. Aligning carbon targets and budgets with the net zero carbon obligation. It puts greater emphasis on balancing capital carbon investment with a much bigger operational and user carbon reductions needed. It requires systems thinking in maximizing carbon reduction while integrating climate resilience in the carbon management process, and prioritizes nature-based solutions to achieve both carbon reduction as well as removal and climate resilience. So to make the revised scope glue together, we had to reflect that whole life is not a linear process from inception to end of life, but a continuous iteration where the need is revisited and the potential of retrofit and repurposing takes precedent. We have updated the work stages to align with the stages in the construction value toolkit. This graph is trying to demonstrate that. And in this way, we believe they apply to both infrastructure and buildings. Showing here is mapping them against the work stages of infrastructure in the old PAS 1192 and the work stages of buildings from the REBA plan of work. I will stop here and hand over to Maria, who's going to give us a bit more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleni. Thank you. Next slide, please. Hi, everyone. So what I wanted to give you a bit of an overview of some of the themes that Eleni summarized that are included in the PAS 2080 update. Unfortunately, due to the time constraints, I cannot do that for the whole of the PAS, but some of the new kind of concepts that are a little bit more tricky. So one of the things that Eleni mentioned is the need for us to move away from individual assets and components of how we decarbonize by building new things into how this whole thing fits into the systems. Everyone is talking about, say, systems thinking and net zero and systems being fundamental to that. But what does it mean for individual parts of the value chain? So one of the things that you see on the screen here is essentially the relationships we try to put together of how individual assets at the bottom of the triangle here, and a building, for example, is an asset, or a pipeline, or a train station, it could be an asset, how they fit with a wider network of assets. So, for example, a development or a transport network or a water, wastewater system, and how all these things fit into the wider system, which could be a sector of the economy, the transport sector, the water sector, the power sector, or the systems of systems, basically. And what does this mean for the individual players who have direct control or influence into the net zero game? Now, when it comes to PAS 2080, it is applicable for delivery of projects and programs of work when it comes to buildings and infrastructure. And these projects and programs of work can range from individual assets or asset components up to networks. If you have an asset owner that is managing, for example, a whole transport network or a water system, and above that, what is the role of the government, regulator, planners, etc.? It's very important to emphasize here that the net zero targets are normally set at the system level, because this is where all the interdependencies are understood, including the behaviors that Eleni mentioned of the users of buildings or infrastructure. So it's very, very important in this PAS that we try to change a little bit the language of trying to see how an individual project, being at the asset or network level, could fit into the system level to meet that net zero target, if you like. If we go to the next slide, please. Now, the important thing here in this revision of PAS 2080 is to take a step back and have another look at the value chain. And we know the theme of this webinar is around innovation and decarbonization in the built environment. And PAS 2080 has always been a carbon management specification. So it's not a technical specification like you have concrete standards or anything else. So it's very, very important to take another look and say, are we ambitious enough in the behaviors and the collaborative behaviors that are required across the value chain in order to accelerate decarbonization? What you see here on the screen is actually from the infrastructure carbon review that shows the value chain in infrastructure, but a lot of those players are also applicable to buildings. So we have the main players like the asset owners or clients, as we call them. We have designers, contractors, product material suppliers. We have the regulators and the government, who actually, the government has the legal obligation to achieve net zero. We have the regulators who set the prices for the users of infrastructure, or the environmental regulator setting the standards. But at the same time, we see the investment community and shareholders and insurance taking a more active interest in the net zero decarbonization agenda. So what we're trying to do with this update is, although there are specific requirements still as the original PAS for asset owners, designers, contractors, product material suppliers, we're trying to provide a little bit more guidance, if you like, in an annex, an informative annex of what could be and should be the role of government and regulators at the systems level, especially because the asset owners normally are only part of the system, including the rest of the supply chain. What would be the role and things to look out for the investors and shareholders, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things we're trying to strengthen in this revision of the PAS are to meet the needs of those different bubbles in the value chain. So you can see some priorities. So for example, an asset owner, when it comes to addressing a net zero challenge, to say, okay, so what is the pipeline of projects I need to implement on the ground. Is it new infrastructure? Is it retrofit? As Eleni said, most of the infrastructure has been already built, so especially in the UK and the western part of the world. So how do I fit into the wider system? What do I need to ask my supply chain to do? How can we work collaboratively? At the same time, we want to encourage designers, contractors, product material suppliers to come forward to challenge asset owners and work together with them and the regulators and their investors to see what is the right solution at the system level. Do I need, for example, in a project, instead of only looking at the materials I need to reduce or use alternative products, like Andrew's mentioned about the low carbon concrete, do I need to actually build something bigger so I can save on the user carbon further up on the system? These are very, very difficult questions, and we're trying to give a little bit more guidance in this update of the PAS, including the guidance document. I think this has been one of the lessons that we've learned from the ICR 8-year progress that Eleni mentioned, was that the collaboration element was quite weak when it comes to delivering infrastructure at the time in practice. So it's very, very important to strengthen those relationships between the different bubbles, being procurement, being other softer innovations, if you like, to accelerate the journey. If we go to the next one, please. Right. So one of the things, this is a draft diagram that we've tried to work on PAS 2080. One of the things that we tried to also strengthen a little bit more in this revision is to the concepts of control and influence. So which of those players in the value chain, being buildings or infrastructure, has the biggest control and influence at what stages of delivery of any projects or programs of work? So if you see at the bottom of this is quite a complex diagram. If you see at the bottom of the diagram, we have the work stages that Eleni showed you earlier in a circle. So we have the need to meet an outcome. We have the different option selections. We have the design of a project, the delivery, which is construction, commissioning, handover, and we have the operational stages. And as Eleni mentioned, this is always a circular kind of has to be a circular diagram and process. Now, when you look at the black bold curve, if you like, this is the ability to control, to reduce whole life carbon. So as we know, at the upfront stages of the need, when we're thinking, oh, do we need to build something or not? Or how can we make a choice of retrofitting or tweaking something in the system? We have the biggest ability to reduce that carbon. And when it comes to the players and the key value chain members who have the greatest level of control at those upfront stages at the systems level, we're looking at the asset owner being key, and also talking to other asset owners in other parts of the system, because an asset owner might have only a small portfolio. As I said, for example, in the transport sector, we can have an asset owner with a surface transport, a road network, whereas they need to be talking to the rail network to see, can we actually try and shift freight, for example, from the road, which are difficult to decarbonize technologies for HGVs, into an electrified rail network. So these conversations need to happen at the beginning, and regulators and planning authorities are key for those. The same with financiers when they invest the money for any new infrastructure or building development. So as we move further towards the optioneering and design stages, we see designers, technical advisors, constructors being key into those, working together and influencing asset owners and their own stakeholders of what option can we choose that has the lowest whole life carbon potential. And as we move further down the stages, obviously we have all the great innovations for materials, alternative technologies that product material suppliers, contractors, designers can bring into the table. But the important message here is that innovation has to be looked at first at the beginning of the need stage, where the ability to reduce whole life carbon is greatest, and collaboration with all these different stakeholders where they have the biggest level of control has to be emphasized. And this is what PAS 2080 update is trying to achieve. And if we go to the next one, please. Here is the carbon reduction hierarchy that we had in the current PAS from 2016 and the guidance document. Again, we have the stages of delivery at the bottom. And what we're saying essentially here, what I mentioned, the ability to influence whole life carbon reduction reduces over time. Even if the accuracy of the information we have, whether it's asset information, carbon data, etc., increases over time, as we know what we're doing. Now, the important point here, the message here is to start early. Whenever we identify a need, can we actually get away with building nothing? Can we come up with an operational solution or a behavioral solution that will achieve the whole life carbon reduction outcome when we're trying to achieve the same service outcome? And then as we move forward, can we reuse existing assets or parts of the system to build less or build clever? Can we use alternative technologies or materials like Andrew mentioned, or renewables or other things, alternative fuels, etc. And when we are on site delivery, it's all about construction practices and different alternative techniques, minimizing waste, having a look at the way we build things. Like, for example, if we have big projects involving loads of earthworks, do we start focusing now at a more strategic level with the supply chain to see how we decarbonize those big excavators, with hydrogen or other fuels, but also look at other alternative construction practices or refurbishment practices. So the message here, although we're saying build less, build nothing, it's about thinking differently. Can you think of getting away with not doing something on the ground, and then you have achieved whole life carbon reduction up to 100%? Well, yeah. And these are the things we're trying to strengthen in PAS 2080. Obviously, there are other things that Eleni mentioned in the clauses. We have new clauses around procurement. We have different concepts around providing more detail of how people can consider the removals and the sequestration element of carbon, which is part of the net zero agenda, and other things. Now, if we go to the next one, please. I think it's going to be the last slide. What I want here is to pause and just tell you that we have been working through the project steering group, and we have a technical advisory panel from many different great participants from across the industry, covering both buildings and infrastructure. And we have worked hard in getting into a second draft of the PAS 2080, and now we're preparing and getting ready for the public consultation, which is going to be in mid-May, where all of you will have the chance to comment on and see whether you think anything is missing, read the document line by line. BSI will manage this process. The consultation period will be 4 weeks, and we really would like you to participate and share your feedback on this, because the better and the more future-proof this document, given the scale of the challenge, the better for everyone, basically. And I think I want to leave it here. I think we're bang on time, and unless Eleni, you wanted to add anything, I think we can, of course, answer any questions in the Q&A. But this is essentially an initial overview of the PAS 2080 update, of the why and the what. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. Nothing from me further. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, both. And yeah, sorry for not mentioning the guidance document, which is a really key part and companion document to the PAS itself. So just a quick one from me, which is that yes, we've got the public consultation in May. What's the projected publication date? Are we looking at sort of September, sometime in the autumn? Have we got a schedule for that?
Yes, we're looking at sometime in the autumn. Obviously, we need to finalize the publication also of the guidance document, because we thought it would be great if both documents were published at the same time. But we're looking at autumn time. Yeah, of course.
Okay, lovely. Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks both of you very much for that, and see you in a little while at the Q&A. All right, so we're going to move on to the final session now, which is Peter Rickerby, who's going to talk about assimilating innovation into domestic retrofit standards. Peter is an energy and sustainability consultant working on retrofit projects for Savills. He also chairs BSI's Retrofit Standards Task Group for us, and has done since its inception, since we created the task group coming out of the Each Home Counts review. And that group is responsible for developing a framework of technical standards to support the implementation of that review. They also recommended setting up a new technical committee, which is now in place. And so not just work on the PAS, but formal standards as well. From 1982 to 2017, Peter was a director of Rickerby Thompson Associates, an energy and sustainability consultancy working for the building and housing industries. He was a technical author of PAS 2035-2019, which is the retrofitting dwellings for energy efficiency, and technical author for PAS 2038 in 2021, which is retrofitting non-domestic buildings for energy efficiency. From 2018 to 2022, Peter was a manager of the UK Centre for Moisture in Buildings and coordinator of the Building Envelope Research Network, both at University College. So thank you, Peter, and we'll hand over to you now for the last session. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire, and good morning, everyone. I think I can change my own slides. Let's just see. Nothing happened. Click on the screen. Yes, good. So my work is about retrofitting buildings, and it's part of the drive to make buildings zero carbon over the next couple of decades. And it's also about standards for retrofit, and that's about making sure we do it well, because we don't have time to do it more than once or go around again, and making sure that we don't do retrofit which has unintended consequences, and particularly in the case of dwellings, unintended consequences in terms of bad circumstances coming out for occupants, for the people who live in those dwellings. So it's a fairly critical thing that we have standards that promote quality and avoid unintended consequences. So we need process standards. I want to just start with a kind of point about the tension between innovation in retrofit and the standards themselves, and this has always been an underlying issue for us. Innovation is about responding to new challenges, and climate change is nothing if not that. And it's about seeking better ways of retrofitting, because we have huge amounts of it to do, and we need to get better at it, get quicker at it, get more reliable at it. It's about developing new materials and new products and new systems, and quite often it involves entirely new processes. Examples would be things like, not very innovative now, but it's been around a few whiles, but Energiesprong, which adopts a completely new way of doing domestic retrofit, for example. So innovation's a good thing. We need to embrace it. Standards are about protecting homes and other buildings and their occupants and the wider environment against unintended consequences or poor outcomes in retrofit, not only to protect the individuals and those particular environments, but also to ensure that we do get where we want to be with regard to zero carbon. So standards are about identifying and promoting established best practice, and they tend to focus on established materials, products, and systems. And they tend to promote established, robust processes that we all have confidence in. So there's a tension between those two things. In a sense, they pull in different directions, and somehow when we're developing standards for retrofit, we have to reconcile that tension. So how can we resolve it? And that leads me to a series of questions, really. Most of the use of our retrofit standards in both the domestic sector and the non-domestic sector is by government to apply those standards to publicly promoted or even publicly funded programs. It's not the exclusive use of the standards, but is where we are mostly at present. So the first question is, should publicly funded retrofit programs be embracing the risk associated with innovation? Because many innovations either don't work, or at least first time don't work, or they do deliver unintended consequences. And it's only by trying them that we discover that we have to do a bit more work to refine them in order to make them robust and reliable, and in many ways suitable for use in standards. So is the public sector, the publicly promoted and funded sector, the right place for innovation in retrofit? And that the second question that of course begs is it reasonable to risk people's homes and health? And particularly at the moment where many of the homes that retrofit is being focused on are amongst the lowest income households and also the least healthy households, actually. And so are we taking further risks that we don't need to? So the question really is, should we be proving innovations somewhere else before we embed them into our retrofit standards? And then the final point is that when retrofit does go wrong, and we've had plenty of examples of that, which led to the Each Home Counts review that Claire mentioned, and led to the setting up of the Retrofit Standards Task Group. When it goes wrong, it goes badly wrong. And very often putting a failed retrofit project right costs 5 times as much as it would have costed to do it right in the first place, and takes a very long time, leaving people in unacceptable circumstances in terms of the states of their homes. So there's a whole load of considerations in there about how we build innovation into retrofit standards. If we embrace innovation, we're going to have to manage the risks. We need to adopt the cautionary principle. We need to seek validation of performance claims. My work is continuously punctuated by people popping up and saying, look at this, it's a new material, it's a new product, it's a new process, a new system, it's the best thing since sliced bread, you need it in your standard. Well, I think we need to seek validation of such claims, and to be sure that actually this thing is as good as sliced bread. We also need to protect homes and occupants against failure. So if we take the risk of innovation, we need to know what we're going to do if it doesn't work, and how we're going to provide redress and remediation for people whose homes have, or even in some cases their health, has been damaged. And therefore, we also need to, as we proceed with innovation, to evaluate the outcomes of innovative projects, and to make sure that we're going in the right direction with them. And then if we're doing well, if it's a successful innovation, we need to update our standards accordingly. And we're now moving to an annual update of the retrofit standards, at least the domestic ones in the UK, in order to be able to learn as we go, because retrofit is about new materials, new products, new processes, new systems, and as we learn, we have to have the standards learn with us. These are the two principal domestic standards. PAS 2035 on the left is, if you like, the process standard for domestic retrofit, which focuses a lot on risk management, identifying risks, and basically is based on the principle that here is a process in this standard that if you follow it will lead you to good outcomes and avoid unintended consequences. And on the right we have PAS 2030, which is the installation process brought about after many failures in retrofit installation about 10 or 12 years ago, and which again is about following a process and using defined competencies amongst installers to ensure that we get good outcomes. Not shown on the screen is PAS 2038, which is in many ways the equivalent of PAS 2035 for non-domestic buildings. It's a robust process. It sets out a robust process for retrofitting commercial buildings. And those standards form part of the BSI retrofit standards framework, of which this is a sort of diagrammatic representation, which was set up as one of the recommendations of the Each Home Counts review. So it was focused initially on the domestic sector, and this diagram is the domestic version. We do have a non-domestic version as well. And one of the recommendations of the Each Home Counts review was a quality mark, so that users of the standards, well, people who are having their homes retrofitted or using programs promoted or funded programs to do retrofit could have confidence in the quality of the outcomes. And that quality mark is Trustmark, which many of you will have heard of. And Trustmark is supported by the Code of Conduct and the Customer Charter, which came out of the Each Home Counts review. The Code of Conduct is about how the industry should behave, particularly with regard to things going wrong, mediation and redress. And the Customer Charter is about what customers, whether they be owner-occupiers or landlords or funding bodies, should expect from the industry, and perhaps what they shouldn't expect. When projects are subject to Trustmark, as all publicly promoted and funded retrofit programs pretty much are now, certainly in England and mostly in Wales and Scotland, then Trustmark requires compliance with PAS 2035. It's the big box in the middle. It's the overarching retrofit process standard. But the point of it being a framework is that PAS 2035 refers to a whole stack of other standards. Bottom left, other BSI standards like PAS 2030, the installation standard, like BS 5250, the moisture management standard, like BS 7913, which is about improving traditionally constructed and protected buildings. And at bottom right, a whole load of non-BSI standards, the insulation industry standards, for example, and the microgeneration certification scheme standards for renewable energy technologies. And there are also, in the middle box at the bottom, lots of new standards being conceived, promoted and developed by or under the auspices of the BSI Retrofit Standards Task Group. But that list in that box is stuff that we're currently working on: an assessment standard, an air tightness and ventilation standard, a thermal comfort standard, an energy advice code of practice, and we've just published a building performance evaluation standard. So this framework is continuously developing. We're adding new good practice, if you like, to it. And the point of it being a framework is that once something is trustmarked and therefore required to comply with PAS 2035, it is also required to comply with all the other relevant standards. So all known and existing current best practice standards get applied to that project. They're brought to bear on it. So it's a way of making sure that we don't leave anything out, that we don't forget anything. So we have to think of our two key standards, PAS 2035 and PAS 2038 for the non-domestic sector, as part of this framework, but they're not the only thing. There are other standards that they bring to bear. Who's responsible for all this stuff? Well, the PAS standards are overseen by the BSI Retrofit Standards Task Group, which is actually a task group of invited technical experts. It's not an industry representative group by any means. It's deliberately formulated from people who have a lot of experience of doing retrofit and understanding what can go wrong. But responsibility for the content of the PASs rests with the steering group. We now have a combined steering group for PAS 2035 and PAS 2030. And they work with the technical authors to define the content and consult on it publicly and to get to a point where it's all agreed. We're currently in BSI moving towards a smaller and better focused steering group for PAS 2035 and PAS 2030, because we've discovered that very large steering groups find it very difficult to agree about things. And so we're trying to make our steering group for retrofit more efficient, for domestic retrofit more efficient. We're also moving towards annual updates of our PASs, as I said, because this is a fast-moving industry. There's lots of pressure to get on with retrofit, to do it quickly, to do it well. Current estimates are that we may have to deliver 5 retrofits a minute for the next 30 years to achieve our getting the housing stock to zero carbon by 2050. So that's a very challenging program of work. So we have to keep up. So the standards will be subject to annual updates. And so we need a process for learning as we go and making changes in response to that learning, but also for assimilating innovations. And my view as the chair of the Retrofit Standards Task Group is that we should be assimilating new innovations into the standards within the 1-year cycle in each case. So if somebody comes along and says, here's an innovation, we need to put this into the industry to promote it, we would like to have it in the standards, properly assessed, of course, and assimilated within that 1-year cycle. People shouldn't have to wait very much longer for the products and materials and systems in which they've invested to be acceptable within the standards framework. The recommendations for updates come from lots of sources. I'm currently collating lists of recommendations for updates from my own colleagues on the BSI Retrofit Standards Task Group, from BAYS, who get lots of quite loud feedback from industry, from the devolved administrations, who like to think that their retrofit problems are different from everywhere else and therefore they need the standards customizing to their particular problems, from consultants and installers who are working on current retrofit programs and learning what works and what doesn't and what's difficult and what's less difficult, and also from feedback from demonstrator programs and trials, which many housing organizations have been working on over the last few months and years. So we have lots of sources of recommendations for updates. And what we're currently planning is to, for each year's update, to discuss the scope of that update with a stakeholder workshop at the beginning of the process each time around. And we're just about to enter our first stakeholder consultation program. So how can we assimilate innovative measures in retrofit? The purpose of the assimilation process and purpose of the update is the same as the purpose of the PAS is: to protect the health and well-being of the occupants and users of the buildings, principally, but also to protect the integrity of the buildings, homes in particular, but also other buildings, and our architectural heritage, as well as, at the same time, supporting timely assimilation of successful innovation. And when we do that, identifying, assessing, and managing the technical risks that come with those innovations. And all of that's about minimizing any potential performance gap, any potential difference between what we think these innovations will do in terms of delivering lower carbon, more energy efficient performance in buildings and what they actually do. So we have a kind of holding position for unvalidated measures, which we're currently starting to discuss with, well, we have been discussing it with the Retrofit Standards Task Group. We'll be discussing it with the steering group shortly. And that is that innovations that are not properly validated, and I'll talk about what validation will involve in a moment, should be treated with caution. We have a value in PAS 2035 called inherent technical risk of a measure. Some measures, some improvements are more risky than others. And so in a particular table in Annex B of PAS 2035, there is a table of those risks. And our holding position is that an unvalidated measure, a new innovation, would always be assigned the highest inherent technical risk to start with, until we've validated its performance. And furthermore, in PAS 2035, there are 3 paths which projects follow through the PAS 2035 process. And they're called A, B, and C, where A is for low risk projects, B is for most projects, and C is for high risk projects. And our holding position also embraces the point that projects with unvalidated innovation involved in them must follow path C. In other words, they must follow the highest risk path, which will mean that they're subject to the most qualified professional attention and the most detailed attention during that period. Nobody at the moment owns this assimilation process. Everybody says we need it. I don't think it's a job for BSI's Retrofit Standards Trust Group, and my suggestion is that it should be chaired and managed by Trustmark, but that's yet to come out in the wash. So at some point, probably within the next 6 weeks, we'll have decided where the assimilation process is going to sit alongside the PASs or in the cycle of updating of the PASs. So how are we going to assimilate innovations? What do we need to do to assimilate innovative measures into PAS 2035 and to some extent also to PAS 2038? First of all, we need independently validated performance. It's no good manufacturers of materials or products or systems or suppliers of them popping up out of the woodwork and saying this is the best thing since sliced bread. We want to know whether it really is. And independent validated performance means needing getting an independent organization to do that work, and it has to come from testing, not just from modeling. We want to see the performance of the building or of the innovation in a building on the ground and get some results from it that we can consider. We want to understand inherent technical risks that are inherent to the particular technology, material, product or system. Because in PAS 2035 Annex B, we have a table of those inherent risks. As I said earlier, we would usually initially assign the highest level of risk, but clearly many things will carry much less risk, but we need to understand what level of risk is appropriate. So part of the testing process and validation of performance has to be also understanding what the risks are and at what level they are relative to other measures. We need to understand the interactions with other measures, because one of the key points about retrofitting buildings is that measures interact with each other, and the risks associated with a combination of improvement measures may be greater than the risks associated with those individual measures on their own. And that's a very common feature of the way improvement measures work in buildings. So we need as well to know about innovations, how the innovation, if built into a retrofit program or specification or design, will interact with other measures alongside it in the packages of measures that we install in buildings. And with those two places where we can use that, in PAS 2035, in Annex B, there's a table where we can put information about interactions, and there's a figure in Annex D, which is called the measures interaction matrix, which allows us to start to categorize the types of interactions we get between different measures in the same building. And then in the domestic sector, innovations have to be able to be assimilated into the SAP energy rating, the standard assessment procedure, because PAS 2035 includes an improvement option evaluation, which is used to underpin a medium-term improvement plan for the building to help us to get it where it needs to be by 2050. And the improvement option evaluation uses the SAP energy rating to make a comparative evaluation of the improvement delivered by different measures in order that we can choose the ones that are appropriate for the building. In the non-domestic sector, that would mean it would have to be able to be modeled in SBEM or with an appropriate TM54 compatible dynamic simulation model. So we have to be able to understand the innovation well enough to model it in the standard models that we use in the standards. And then finally, well, not quite finally, we need to be able to specify the competencies required of operatives who are going to install this new innovative measure. Because in PAS 2030, we have a series of annexes which define the competencies to which must be present amongst the installers in order to be sure to give us confidence that measures can be properly installed. And those competencies are actually certified by certification bodies under PAS 2030. So we not only need to know what the competencies that the installers need to install this innovation correctly, but we also need a certification body that's prepared to certify that the installers do have those competencies. And we're working towards replacing the annexes in PAS 2030, which are the competency annexes for different measures, with a new online competence matrix, rather like the one they've developed in Scotland, in order that we can update the competencies required by the standards quite quickly, rather than having to wait until PAS 2030 is updated each time. So assimilating innovations is, in some ways, you could say we've set up lots of hurdles for people to jump over, but that's because of this tension between the standards being there to promote robust processes and protect the users and occupants of buildings against poor retrofit and the unintended consequences of poor work on the one hand, but at the same time to embrace innovation and let us make the most use of it. So these are a set of hurdles that we're expecting people to go through in order to prove the performance of their innovations before we will assimilate them, or as we assimilate them into the standard. And in the meantime, we take a cautionary approach to that work. So I think, see if I can get it to move. It's not going. There we go. Sorry, I'll go back one. That's really all I wanted to say. I'm sure there are plenty of questions, and I'll be happy to take those during the Q&A session that's coming along in a moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Peter. And how fascinating to see the similarities between some of the issues with new cementitious materials and domestic retrofit products. When you're looking at innovation, the risks are really real, and the way to sort of address them is sort of grappling with similar issues. I think that was pretty clear. All right, so let's move now to the Q&A session. We'd all like to switch our cameras back on. I've got a few highly targeted questions, and then perhaps we can have a bit more of a sort of general discussion around. Well, certainly I'm interested in the whole imperative of actually driving some of this work forward and making sure it happens. But just a bit more specifically, first of all, Andy, yes, you are there. So Andy, first of all, does the route map give timelines for what needs to be done in the route map, or is it just a signposting of key steps? Is one of the questions that's come through.
The route map is definitely a signpost for strategies and what can be done, but the next step section gives a timeline for each of the recommendations.
Okay, that's great. And what is the sort of coverage? It's going to 2050, presumably, is it? It's a sort of.
The strategies will be in play by 2050, but essentially we need to adopt the recommendations that are currently there and future recommendations, because what I must add is that the route map will be revised on a yearly basis. That will become a yearly task for LCCG members to do that. But essentially, we need to be there. We need to be in a good place by 2035, which means we have very little time to think about it. It's now all about action.
Yeah. Again, a bit of a very specific one for Maria and Helene. Is past 2080, apologies, will past 2080 include obligations for manufacturers, like CCPI says, i.e. requiring manufacturers to conform compliance, to carry out, I guess, a conformity?
So shall I have a go at this? We haven't gone into that level of detail, but there are specific requirements for different parts of the value chain. You will appreciate it's going to be quite a tome if we try and pick each and every discipline separately in terms of requirements. So we're trying to stick to the original idea, which was we need a slender document that is applicable to a wide range of audience without being overly prescriptive. It is about the management. How do you take consideration and everything? What is the how you should think about carbon, but not try to silo it again into very specific requirements. And we have to do everything we can to keep this a slender document. In fact, we're trying to reduce it from the original size, because there is a lot of feedback that says, oh, it's too complicated, it's too long, we haven't had time to read it all. And so we're extracting only a small bit of the whole process, which is sort of missing the point. So the first answer to your question, to the question, Claire, is not explicitly, but hopefully the requirements are sort of covering everything that that supply chain should be thinking about, and manufacturers. Maria?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, just it's exactly that, Ellen, what you said. Just for me to add, taking a step back for people perhaps who are not familiar with past 2080. I know we're focusing on the revision, but as we showed you in the value chain, and as also Eleni mentioned in her presentation, the requirements are for asset owners, managers owners, designers, constructors, and product material suppliers. So as Eleni says, we're trying to broaden those categories. So if a manufacturer of a product or a material you know, is willing to build more capability on carbon management and want to be conforming and validating their organization, then they should look at the requirements for the product material suppliers. But as Eleni says, it's not specific for a specific manufacturing sector, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I think that was my my oversight. I think yes, the Code of Construction Product Information, which has just recently come out from the CPA, is what's being referred to. But all right, thanks. Thank you very much for that. And one for Peter around specific examples, please, of where retrofit projects can go wrong. I mean, I know there are a lot of them, but just to give that insight, that picture really around that.
Well, Rick Holland at Innovate UK said that retrofit is not rocket science, but it is complicated. And I think that's one of the key lessons we learned from the Retrofit for the Future program 10 or 12 years ago now. Basically, most of the risks associated with retrofit are related to moisture in some way. They're related to thermal bridging, thermal bypass, condensation, mold growth, water penetration, decay, deterioration, rot, damp, and so on. All the things that can affect the durability of the building itself, the fabric, and also all the things that can affect the health of the people in the building, particularly mold. So what we're trying to do with good practice standards is to ensure that those problems that we know about, the moisture related ones, are well managed. And so we have these key players in retrofit projects called the Retrofit Coordinator, and actually the qualification they have is called Retrofit Coordination and Risk Management. And what they're trained to do is to know where the risks are and how best to manage them, whether it be eliminating thermal bridging at corners, junctions and edges, or making sure that the ventilation is adequate when we tighten up the building envelope with air tightness and insulation measures, or those kinds of things.
Yes, indeed, lots of examples of that up in the Northwest. All right, so I mean, I think it would be, I'd quite like to open this up a little bit around thinking about how far can voluntary requirements go really in this whole area of trying to drive change through industry. You know, how much do we need to mandate some of these activities? You know, what policy imperatives would be really helpful? I mean, you know, I mean, it was interesting on the past 2080 presentation, you know, about asking builders or engineers to potentially opt for a build nothing option. I wonder if that's ever going to, you know, be a choice that they'll accept, or for Portland Cement users and providers to switch. I mean, you know, the sort of pressures on are so high for in these areas, and I just wondered, you know, really can voluntary requirements really work to get us where we need to go? And perhaps Helene, Maria, you might want to pick that up first.
Yes, thanks, Claire. I think yes, turkeys voting for Christmas has repeatedly come to mind when we're talking about build nothing for the engineering fraternity and the construction industry, and that shouldn't be the way, to be honest. Sorry, answering your first question, how far can voluntary requirements take us? I think we spend more time presenting and trying to engage as wide an audience as possible, also recognizing how many different views there are out there that we're trying to bring together. So we didn't realize at the beginning how ambitious exactly was what we were trying to do. But it is, you know, they have to bear fruit, voluntary requirements, because policy on one hand, you know, high level policy moves very fast. You know, that diagram that showed what happened between 2016 and now is pretty impressive. You know, we have a law, we have international agreements, we have huge emergencies that are of global scale. It is unthinkable to see, you know, how quickly all this developed. But policy at sector level or manufacturers and so on moves really, really slow. And I think some of the stuff Peter's described is exactly what we're grappling with across the board. So changing hearts and minds and taking that fear of I need to construct for a living is something we have to do in our own industry. The other way of seeing it, I'm an engineer. I was trained to be an engineer and solve problems. The problem solving we have to do is not how much concrete we can pour in one go. The problem solving is how do we continue to construct or develop our built environment, but reverse that environmental degradation that we have caused, and we will pay, and we are already paying as a society and an economy hugely. So, you know, we can solve the problem if we put our minds to it, but we need to train ourselves again. Sorry, shut up. Sorry, Maria, please go ahead.
No,
I would add to that what Helene said. You know, in the absence of specific policies that mandate specific actions by everybody, it is incumbent upon us who know how to do things. And as being engineers, working within the industry, we are by our very nature quite innovative anyway, because we face problems every day, and we solve those problems. So it all starts, I think, in the absence of specific policies, high-level policies, it all starts with the client, with their mandating what they want. That then becomes an obligation for people to innovate who are working on a specific project. So we don't have to wait for the powers that be and those in Parliament to issue specific high-level policies and limitations, restrictions, and so forth. We can do that quite well ourselves, but it starts with the client.
I mean, I thought the risk of introducing a negative kind of note, I don't think there's any example of the PASs for retrofit having been picked up voluntarily by any organization without being mandated, usually by funding. And this is because we're asking people to do things in a new way, using new materials, products, and systems that are a bit challenging, or involve changing the way people do things, as we've all talked about, usually involve a little bit more time and money to get it right, do it properly. And actually, I think in many cases, people in the industry are a little scared of doing things a new way. And they're cautious about it because there's a risk to them. And so PAS 2035 and PAS 2035 have not been picked up by any organizations except where they're attached to the money. Some government promoted or funded program which provides funding makes it a condition. The compliance with the standards is a condition. And I think in the case of PAS 2038 for non-domestic buildings, there are none at all yet because there are no policies yet. So there is a role for local level policy, or not high level, but next level down policy, in making sure that we actually do promote the right quality standards in these innovatory processes. And I think there's a tension there as well, because my experience of governments is that they don't lead, they follow. So it's quite hard to persuade them to, I think we've been really lucky with, for instance, PAS 2035, that they've funded some PASs that are designed to make people, to encourage people to do things better, but they don't know the government will normally come along later and say, this standard's been around for 5 years, you should be using it. They don't develop the standard or facilitate the standard themselves. So I think there's a cultural thing in there as well. And that comes back to leadership by all of us. We have to be making the case not just to the industry to follow these better practices and use these innovations, but also making the case to government to align legislation and promotional programs and so on with those standards in order that the things can sing together.
Maria?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely, yeah. These are really great, actually, views and viewpoints we've heard, and I don't want to repeat any of those. I mean, I fully agree with everything people said. The only thing I would like to add to that is the importance of essentially the main reason why people do not do things voluntarily is either because it's too expensive, or because they don't have the skills, or because they don't understand the risk. So I think it's very important for us in the industry to really build our capability, as Eleni and Andrew mentioned, of saying, all right, do I really understand the risk I'm taking on long-term performance of outcomes from assets, etc., if I do things differently? And to do that, we need, I know it's client driven, you mentioned, Andrew. At the same time, I really feel the clients need to build their own skills as well, because the easiest thing has been, let's get everything to the supply chain. And then you have the investors on the insurance and say, well, there are no standards or laws or policies. So why do you want to do things differently? Because we only invest in things that we're absolutely sure about. So I think there is a piece here when it comes to innovation, that we're talking about innovation today, is not only the technologies, the innovation, but how do we get those risk models and risk allocation right, and while strengthening the skills in the engineering community to better understand the risk when it comes to decarbonization. I think that's the only thing I would like to add on this year.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds more like pull rather than push from perhaps regulatory pushing and trying to go down that sort of funding, or educating the client. I mean, is that still very much something that needs to be done?
Yeah, I think so. And just listen to what Maria was saying. It strikes a chord when within the LCCG and my own work that I do on a daily basis, we come across the most obvious blocker is new technology. What is the risk, and can we get insurance warranty? And what we find, and I'm not casting dispersions across the insurance market, but what we find is that there is probably a distinct lack of knowledge and experience within the insurance market about the subject matter, which potentially prevents them from signing off and providing a warranty. Default position is to rely on, this is what we've always done, these are the standards that we follow, therefore we can provide a warranty in accordance with that. But that's not always the case now. Cement chemistry, concrete technology, it moves at a pace, but our supporting standards can't move at that same pace. So we need to disseminate that knowledge and that experience, not just across the industry, but to those supporting industries, such as the insurances and warranties and so forth, so that they understand what it is that we're trying to innovate.
Thank you.
Maybe I could just add to that
Please, yeah,
one of the very first principles that the Retrofit Standards Task Group adopted in about 2016 was that standards on their own are not enough, and that we need guidance. Every standard should be combined with guidance to explain why and how, as well as what. And I think we've not been very good at that, to be honest. We've struggled quite hard in some cases to create guidance that goes alongside it. But that's all about creating documents that the insurers and so on will understand themselves and can relate to, rather than just something that's a bit dry that the members of the industry are saying they want to comply with, or they're being asked to comply with. So guidance is a sector I think that we are a bit weak on.
Agreed.
I mean, obviously, PAS 2080 has got that guidance that you're developing. So,
if I could come back in for a second, Claire, I think, yes, guidance is big, and we're spending, well, we will be spending almost as much, if not more time creating that guidance document. In fact, the existing guidance was probably more read as a document than the standard itself, because it is it has examples, it has explanations that are, you know, a normative document may be a bit more dry to read. But I'd also like that in that pool, which I think Mary is absolutely right, hugely important to, you know, have, you know, explain what it is that we're doing, take on the journey and train ourselves and retrain everybody, and including the industries around us that don't necessarily have the full picture. But it is a commercial incentive if we think about it. You know, that's why we have identified the financiers that in that very key stakeholder group as the ones that could pull the stops and make things happen. If you start thinking of the commercial levers, all the new things, the carbon taxes, the requirements left, right, and center, and how fast as I say, high-level policies changing and mandating financiers to have KPIs along carbon, you know, we get a completely different picture. So that's where, you know, it is an open door almost for these voluntary requirements to get into, if we engage better with those groups and have a better storytelling around that. My view,
yeah.
anyway.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, I guess there's you know, we've had some questions around timescales and all of that, and certainly around the innovative products in retrofit. There's been a lot of frustration out there. It's a lot of frustration about the speed or how we can speed up these processes, and I wonder how, you know, what we can do to try and make things move more quickly. I mean, I think that given the levels of risk in all of these areas, it's not that easy. But how do we stop people feeling so frustrated when they're trying to sort of move in these new areas and they just keep coming up against blocks and you know, things that seem to be put in place to stop things moving forward in the way that they would like. So it's a difficult one.
I think for me, Claire, is a combination again of the things Eleni, Andrew, and Peter mentioned. So if we're saying that one of the biggest blockers is the fear of I don't understand the risk or that sort of thing, then absolutely Andrew is right that says the asset owner, the client, is the main lever. So perhaps it's more about just taking some of those leading clients, because leadership is key here, and this is one of the major areas of PAS 2080 around leadership, is to work with their supply chain to identify those areas where we need to be doing something different, better understand the risk and the risk allocation so that others can follow and have that ripple effect. Because I don't think we just need to wait and say, oh, we can't because the standards don't allow us to do this, or we can't because the regulator don't tell us this. As Eleni, Andrew, and Peter mentioned, there are some pull factors from all parts of the value chain, essentially. So it's a case of just, you know, try to find some many pathfinder projects for the more difficult areas to decarbonize and just getting it up there. That's how I see this, at least from a more practical perspective.
Yeah. I guess pathfinder projects and sort of piloting. I mean, we talked about that, Peter, on the these new products, actually, in not just modelling, but actually getting them in situ. Yeah.
But I think it's also, you mentioned barriers, Claire, and I think it's not necessary for people to encounter barriers for their innovations by surprise. We can lay out what our expectations of them are for demonstrating that their innovations will work. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to say these are the hoops you have to jump through, but we need to be explicit about those hoops and upfront, rather than people discovering them when they've sunk a couple of million into their innovation and done loads of work already, and they suddenly expect it to be changing the world. It's all about being open, I think, about this stuff.
That's a very good point, Peter, and that's something that we in the LCCG recognise. Really, it's what we have seen over the last five years or more is new technologies pushing to come to market on the back of a good idea or a few lab samples. You know, we set out that road to demonstration through to TRL9, and it can be lengthy and it can be very expensive, and not all technologies will get to the end because the very nature of them, they're just not suitable for the applications. That is what entrepreneurs need to be aware of. Just because there's a good idea at the outset doesn't mean to say it's going to get to fruition and be commercially viable. So we set it out what needs to happen to introduce innovation successfully, and when to do it, who to speak to, what to ask, what to demonstrate, what to collect, what to present. And you know, it is hard work. I think where innovation and new technology needs to be, they need to be in a position where they can ask a client, give us a good reason why you can't use it, rather than the client telling them multiple reasons why they shouldn't use it.
Yeah, very good. Well, I think I think we can. We should wind up there. There's a couple more slides, I think, and we've been going a fair bit of time. So thank you all so much for your contributions today, and I think that was a really interesting chat as well at the end. So thank you, Andy, Helene, Maria and Peter for your very stimulating contributions. And let's all turn off our webcams, and I'll remind everybody about the Net Zero SP, Net Zero Solution Pack that we heard about. And please do attend some of the other sessions in BSI's Net Zero webinars week. We have the food sector later on today being looked at, healthcare tomorrow, and the role of data and cyber physical systems in achieving net zero on Thursday, so as well. So we're just about halfway through the week now, so thank you all very much for your attendance and for submitting your questions, and see you again sometime. Thank you.